Peace Offering by Shaun J. Nigro. Narrated by Todd. Would you mind giving me the rundown one more time, Miss Cassidy? Didn't you read the report, Doctor? Yes, of course. I like to corroborate details, though. I have the highest respect for all civilizations, however primitive they may seem at the outset. Though in this case, I think, from all that I've gathered in my own readings, we can safely mark this one on the order of 23rd century Earth. Cassidy shrugged. Do you not agree? I'm just the translator, Doctor. I don't think my opinion qualifies here. Humor me. Dr. Adams smiled, pulling his spectacles off. He knew his reputation preceded him, as they say, but he had always thought it such a shame that so many of his colleagues, brilliant though they were, felt the need to dispense with the warm-hearted humility of civilian life. Well, Cassidy smiled back, they've certainly had their share of discoveries and periods of enlightenment. But, Adams prodded, well, it seems rather odd that most of these advancements in their society are clustered around the last 100 years. Some of the major ones, including beaconing methods, are even more recent. Some babies grow up fast, Cassidy. You've read the histories of the 20th century in old America? He was attempting not to sound condescending. He really did want to explore Cassidy's unease with the mission, though he held on to the confidence in his own mind. He had, after all, spent most of his life in his field, publishing several volumes of analyses on interstellar trade and offering solutions in embargo eras to the Council of Celestial Territories and the United Nations of Terra on more occasions than he could remember. Only once had he come up short on a solution to a very complicated problem, during the uranium embargo of Europa in, what year was that? Well, it was irrelevant now. Ancient history that worked itself out. After all, no other qualified person was able to determine a solution for that one. Yes, I remember reading a book about that. Then you know that civilizations grow and expand at an increasingly rapid rate. Once the Industrial Revolution came about, man, he paused, looking at her, and woman were practically on an expressway to the stars. Negating the cockamamie fabrications of crackpots about the secret alliance with an earlier interstellar civilization, and corroborated by comparisons and countless studies of similar experiences with other races we've met along the way, it seems an elegantly simple conclusion to come to about Vesuvius 9. I think you are right in that regard, Doctor, but... Cassidy's eyes trailed off out her window, through which she and Dr. Adams could clearly see the mountainous landscape morphing slowly into view as the orbiter descended. XR-61, a voice came crackling over a walkie-talkie. One of the two military men with him on the orbiter, members of the Terra Space Force, picked up the device clipped to his camouflage vest to answer the call. Yeah, XR-61, over. Enlisted members of the force were stripped of their civilian names and given a random assignment of letters and numbers, randomly regenerated on every new tour. This was to confuse enemy spies and minimize the potential for sabotage amongst its own squads. Though they would never admit it, Dr. Adams suspected it was to dehumanize the men as well as to keep them from developing too strong an ego or alliance to any one territory. Interstellar power struggles were a constant in their time, and the best and least wasteful use of any soldier was to ensure that he or she could simply follow orders and fight for whatever entity was delivering the orders at the time. The voice on the other end of the walkie-talkie came crackling through again. Update, XR-61. Cargo is secure, sir. Destination in sight. Over. The cargo aboard was, of course, Dr. Adams. Inanimate or not, Adams knew that this was standard protocol, even if they were nowhere near a red zone. Affirmative, XR61. Proceed. The walkie-talkie crackled once more and clicked off. XR61 clipped the device back to his chest and stared straight ahead at no one and nothing in particular. He held a rifle close by his side, looking like a perfect clone of his partner who sat next to Dr. Adams. XR62, was it? Go on, Cassidy, Adams said, seeing that his translator was reading over the report again. Well, Doctor, I'm not discrediting your experience and expertise in this matter, of course. Adams nodded. But, well, first of all, why are you so quick to dismiss the early interaction theory? I mean, maybe the little green men thing is all hogwash. They both knew that there was no such thing as little green men. In 1,000 years of space travel, and after countless civilizations had been discovered and studied, not one little green man had popped up. Not even, the doctor thought, in other civilizations' records. But, Cassidy continued, who's to say there wasn't something going on? Lost artifacts. Hell, even blueprints. We're still digging old tools up all the time on Terra. Dr. Adams thought about this. It was a common question from those outside of his field. It was, he had to admit, an intriguing idea, and many undergrads had been drawn to the field by just such questions. But the ones who made it through the system to rise to the rank of doctor always left such notions in the cafeteria. Good for VR pulp and hallucinatory brainstorming, bad for science. It's not an invalid conclusion to come to, Cassidy, he said, trying not to embarrass her. But it is A, as yet unproven, and B, a great underestimation of the scientific mind. I do not think it is at all extreme or even dogmatic to see not only the human mind, but all intelligent minds, negating little green men, as capable of producing the fruits of their own intellectual labors. Science, Cassidy, is the cornerstone of civilization. It is human ingenuity, in particular, that has gotten us to the very place we find ourselves in. I mean, Adams continued with growing pride, look at us, descending into only the most recent of discovered atmospheres harboring intelligence that has smashed the shackles of its own physical existence. No, they may not be beyond their moons yet in terms of actual interstellar travel, but their minds have succeeded in expressing their existence across the stars. We respond to such entreaties because we are, like them, proud of our perseverance. We are, like them, proud of all that we have achieved, but never satisfied so long as the universe beckons us to its outermost limits. Adams finished with a finger in the air, as if testing the direction of a non-existent wind. He practically leapt out of his seat before realizing where his pride had taken him in dialogue. Adams was relieved to find Cassidy had not determined him to be crazy. She simply sat, smiling. No doubt, he thought, impressed with my dedication and commitment to science. Valid points, Doctor, but there's still that what if. Even so, Cassidy, even if you are correct in your analysis, though I think you and I both realize the absurdities inherent in this little thought experiment we've entertained, it is safe to say that, given our ability to respond to Vesuvius's beacon and, further, to act on it by coming straight to the civilization's door, Dr. Adams took a breath. Given all that, we have clearly demonstrated our superiority. I've assured the Council that they are in good hands. The orbiter began to shake slightly with turbulence as its descent brought them into the upper atmosphere of Vesuvius 9, where a mountain range could be seen stretching into the distance of a hazy blue sky. Dr. Adams could see out his own window that the land was also dotted with what looked to be volcanoes. One in particular, where another mountain range stopped, seemed to be covered in a faint black smoke that indicated a recently active eruption. Doctor, Did you know about the other 2 planets in this solar system? Cassidy asked, handing the report back to him.
Very little, I must admit.
Adams put his spectacles back on and began skimming the report again himself.
I didn't have much time to brush up on the details of Vesuvius, as you know. They practically dragged me out of my study. But, well, I recall that they have sent beacons of their own, which is exciting.
Yes, they have, and they were much closer in proximity to our trajectory.
I see.
Adams had not known this, but he didn't see what the point in bringing it up was. So, Doctor, I'm a little concerned that you don't see the big picture. The Council does not act on behalf of science as much as a soldier of the Space Force, she nodded toward XR-61, would act on behalf of a farmer.
That is true, Cassidy,
Adams agreed. He had known all too well the difficulties of working with members of the Council.
At times, he contemplated the consequences of the dilemma Cassidy was positing, but he never spent more than a few minutes on it before redirecting his attention to the many more important matters of his field. And indeed, the matters for which he had studied and was being paid to remedy.
I'll be honest, Dr. Adams, I'm a little concerned with this one, and I only say this because I respect you and the work you have done.
Adams noticed XR-61 break character for a second, glancing down at Cassidy, who herself did not seem to notice. He thought he noticed the soldier's grip tighten on his gun as well, but he couldn't be sure with the increasing turbulence. Thank you, Cassidy, he smiled gratefully. That means a great deal.
Of course, she smiled back. I guess all I'm saying is, don't be disappointed if everything isn't all that it's cracked up to be.
Adams gave Cassidy a questioning glance. What a curiously abrupt thing to say. Nothing is ever what it's cracked up to be. That was precisely the reason Adams did what he did. He was driven by the constant pull of new discoveries and reaffirmations linking all his hypotheses together. Even if they proved to be brutes, the beings of Vesuvius 9 would be invaluable for research and trade. Adams glanced out the window again. He could see that they were lowering now into a valley surrounded by one of those prominent mountain ranges. The outlines of tall reflective skyscrapers were coming into view now, and he thought he could even make out an orderly procession of dots which he took to be the hover car traffic he had read about in the report. I'd be a foolish anthropologist not to revel in the merits of the trips like these my field affords me from time to time.
Of course, Doctor. That is very understandable.
Tell me about the Vesuvius language, Adams said, not taking his eyes off the report where he had flipped to the linguistics section. He could only make out symbols that reminded him of Mayan and Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was precisely this lack of understanding in the symbols that warranted Cassidy's involvement in this trip. In the past, Dr. Adams had been acquainted with and accompanied by many translators of the sort.
Well, as you can see, it's hieroglyphic. It bears its closest resemblance to Terra's Mayan language.
What's this? Adams put his finger on one of the symbols that seemed to represent a face with large eyes, claws, and a fire?
That is one of their highest deities.
Deity? Adams shot her a concerned glance.
Yes, Doctor. These beings are extremely religious. They worship a handful of gods representing, well, by comparison to Terran ancient cultures, they're pretty standard. They have their wind god, a water god, and that one, a fire god.
Interesting. Adams stared down at the symbol. A civilization as advanced as this hanging on to primitive theological fallacies? Adams thought of something then, realizing a connection between what he had read and understood and this new knowledge, and the sight that was unfolding upon their descent to the planet. I hypothesize that this fire god in particular has come to them as a result of the landscape. I noticed a minute ago that there looked to be an active volcano at the end of those mountain ranges. I suppose eruptions here are common, which is remarkable considering the impeccable and sufficiently advanced state of the capital. Adam's mind was alight with ideas about Vesuvius 9 that reminded him again of why he loved his field so much. These beings must have some sort of material capable of keeping such disasters at bay, unless their cities are clustered in non-active areas. Adams thought he noticed XR-61 glance at him quickly now, but the turbulence had made it hard to tell. He held onto his armrest with his free hand, holding tight to the report in his other hand. Alas, this is why we invite the anthropologist to the party, Adams smiled, afraid he had lost all control of his pride now in front of Cassidy. Oh well, he thought, can't please everyone. So this is everything they sent out about themselves in the beacon? Adams asked. This was a stupid question. Of course it was. It was standard as far as new civilization beacons went, but he could hardly contain his excitement now. That's everything on their end, Cassidy said, looking out the window again. The orbiter was over the city now, and Adams saw that it was even more magnificent than he had imagined from afar. The buildings did seem to be constructed with some manufactured material, or was it natural? Adams thought that the material on the buildings resembled parts of the range he had noticed, particularly the volcanic geography. How fascinating! Adams stared on in awe. The orbiter glided through the air, free of turbulence now. Before Adams could ask any more questions, the orbiter landed softly on the top of one of the taller buildings in the city. The soldiers stepped off first and stood on either side of the ramp that had unwound from the side of the craft. Cassidy went first, at Adams' insistence, and then he followed around. The first thing he noticed was what felt like a wall of heat. The humidity reminded him of a trip to New Bangkok when he was an undergrad. But that was his closest comparison, as the humidity here felt like it had to be somewhere in the 90% range. Jesus, he said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead that had already begun to form. The soldiers did not look fazed, but Adams could see that they were sweating as well. He wondered if it would be acceptable to break protocol to offer them something to wipe their faces with. Cassidy was sweating too, holding a hand above her eyes and squinting as a red sun had gotten brighter after emerging fully from a low-hanging cloud cluster. Not far from the orbiter, 3 Vesuvian beings stood waiting. They were humanoid, except for skin that was almost scaly, with a darker tone, no doubt a product of living in such a scorching climate. Adams was beginning to digest and accept the reality of this Vesuvian fire god. The beings approached, and Adams could see that all 3 of them had eyes with a light green tint. He smiled, thinking of the little green men. Cassidy approached the beings, placing her palm on each of theirs, which they had extended outward facing up. She spoke in a tongue that Adams would have never placed with the symbols of the language he had seen on paper, and they responded. They didn't seem to smile, but he guessed things were going smoothly. One of the beings glanced at Adams and bowed slightly to him. Impulsively, Adams bowed back. Cassidy came back to Adams and the soldiers. They are pleased to meet us. Don't they want to, actually meet us? No, it is not their custom. They say they wish only to communicate with me. That's odd. In all his flights, Adams had never once come into contact with a culture with a custom like this. He had expected to converse face-to-face with the leaders of this civilization, perhaps even a fellow anthropologist, even if they could not understand each other without Cassidy's help. Yes, but so it goes. Wasn't that in the report? No, I don't think it was. Dr. Adams blushed. He found himself embarrassed now. He had read the report over multiple times and was sure that he had gleaned every notable detail of these beings and their civilization. He was beginning to feel like he actually was cargo. Extra baggage, more like it. Well, they only want to talk to me, but of course you and our soldiers can follow. They did invite you here after all." Adams found this last statement a bit odd too, but he knew what she meant. The beacon had been meant for anyone that happened to pick it up. It was just a chance that the Terran astrophysicist had gotten wind of it first. And of course, Dr. Adams was just one of over 1 trillion members of his kind. "So we go with them now. There is what I guess we would call a hover car waiting for us a few floors down." Adams remembered the highway he had seen in descent. "And from there, we toured the city which, as the beacon and the report informed us, is the capital city of Vesuvius 9. This much Dr. Adams did remember from the report. He smiled. "Sounds good to me. I assume I'm free to take notes?" "Of course." Cassidy beamed, almost too excited. What good would an anthropologist be, after all, without a thorough analysis of the new culture which he finds himself in? Adams fumbled in his vest pockets and finally pulled out a small gray spherical object. It was a seed device, which most of the Terran population owned, and which Adams had used time and time again to record audio with. There were macroscopic cameras embedded all around the device as well, so that, when uploaded into a simulation software, panoramic 360-degree videos and photos could be revisited. On their flight through the city, in a hovercar that was similar in some ways to the cars of Terra, though smaller and operating on some unknown and unseen principle of mechanics, Dr. Adams flew, with Cassidy on the seat in front of him. The soldiers sat next to them, one for each seat, still grasping their guns tightly and staring ahead blankly. Adams did not envy these men and their duty. The 3 Vesuvians they had met on the roof, or that Cassidy had met, flew in a car ahead of them, making Adams believe that theirs was operating on an auto-follow function. Not a very interesting technology to the average Terran, but peculiar in this strange new God-fearing society. Over the edge of the car, Adams could see rows of traffic that seemed to line up all the way to the ground. But they were so high up, even having launched from a lower level of the skyscraper, that Adams could barely make out the ground. He wondered if the Vesuvian society was built up on some cliché of hierarchy that pitted the lowest and poorest branch of their kind on the surface. It wasn't an uncommon practice throughout the galaxy, but again, the overlapping and seemingly discordant elements of the Vesuvians made it stand out. They had met, presumably, the most distinguished of the Vesuvians at the very top of a skyscraper, though Adams guessed they still hadn't met the actual people in charge. The 3 Vesuvians in the car ahead, he had gathered, were merely messengers, as trivial in the world order as Terra's own messengers and translators, i.e. Cassidy. "That's a lot of traffic." "Yeah, but we haven't stopped once. It's pretty fluid. Pretty damned impressive." They flew on, catching the eye of many pedestrian Vesuvians. One car in particular had smaller versions of the creatures that Adams took to be children. They were leaning over the side of their cars, pointing at Adam. This made him perk up again, remembering that he was, in fact, an important asset on this trip. He was the anthropologist, after all, a distinguished ambassador of the Terran race. He imagined what the Vesuvian children were saying to each other. "There's Terran Dr. Adams. He's a pretty big deal where he's from. I can't believe he's here." A little further up the floating highway, they approached a large hovering orb. Around the orb was a screen that projected a Vesuvian head that Adams could only guess was some sort of anchorman. The screen flickered as they approached, and Adams nearly leapt out of the car when a bright red fire lit up the screen. He could see the claws and a pair of eyes blinking slowly. It was some sort of CGI rendition of the Vesuvian fire god symbol he had seen in the report. The screen flickered again, and the Vesuvian anchorman continued his report, only to be interrupted shortly after by what Adams could only understand to be some sort of Vesuvian sunscreen ad. It was funny to see such a trivial similarity between the Vesuvian and Terran races, But this, Adam knew, was also not uncommon. Every advanced society had some sort of trade-based economy. Intelligent creatures were always in need of and at the whim and mercy of their environment. Sunscreen here was especially appropriate. And, Adams knew, since he still could not understand the Vesuvian language, that much of what he was pretending to understand was really just his brain's poor excuse for a translation, attempting to humanize and make rational the things he was seeing. It was similar to the way humans back on Terra sometimes swore they saw a man's face in the moon. It wasn't there, obviously. Years of observation and actual lunar travel had proved that. As they rounded the screen, which seemed to be at the center of some sort of hover car roundabout, Adams thought he noticed more and more of the other Vesuvian flyers looking at him and bowing slightly. When the car was finally back on a straighter lane of traffic, he could see the edge of the valley growing larger in front of them. At the end of the lane of skyscrapers, a massive volcano that looked to be as tall or taller than the buildings around him was staring him down. As they approached, entering a large shadow that had formed as a result of the red Vesuvian sun moving behind the peak of the volcano, Adams began to grow certain that this was their destination. Adams thought, toward the belly of the fire god. Adams looked up in awe as they landed near the base of the volcano. He almost fell over before giving up on trying to see the top that had been so clear from the traffic on the highway. They were almost literally on the edge of the city now, where the valley began to slope upward into the rocky side of the volcano. "I thought we'd be staying in the city longer before exploring the geography of the planet," Adams laughed nervously. "Yes, me too. But hey, I guess we know where this fire god idea comes from. I guess I'd worship this beast to some degree if I lived so close to a volcano." He laughed again, fixing his spectacles since they had gone crooked when he stepped off the hover car. One of the three Vesuvians was talking to Cassidy now. Cassidy turned back to Adams, who was struggling to keep his footing on the rocky ground. The smell of sulfur reminded him of eggs, which reminded him that he had not eaten breakfast that morning in his excitement. "So, the Vesuvians have been mining a mineral forged in volcanoes like these for about 100 years. They say it's where their cities get their strength, that and the goodwill of their fire god." 100 years, huh? "Yep," Cassidy said, almost seeming to say, "Are you getting it now?" "That's pretty incredible. Why did it take so long to discover this? And how did they survive to evolve as much as they have for so long without it?" "That's the part I don't really understand. This Vesuvian," she said, gesturing toward the being that greeted her first on top of the skyscraper, "says they were told to mine the material by the sky god." She gestured toward the sky, where they themselves had come from. Adams looked at Cassidy curiously. "Little green men?" Cassidy laughed. "Something like that, I guess." One of the Vesuvians was shouting in his language now, pointing up at the sky toward the peak of the volcano, or what they could make of it. Adams, Cassidy, and the soldiers looked up to find another flying vehicle, this one larger and having a polished look that set it apart as seeming more distinguished than the pedestrian cars of the highway. "Our chariot awaits," Cassidy smiled. They boarded the craft, this time followed by the three Vesuvians and joining another older-looking Vesuvian who had come with the car from the peak of the volcano. This new Vesuvian spoke to Cassidy, then bowing slightly in Adams' direction. He appeared to be wearing some religious garment, dressed in a long white robe with streaks of shimmering veins of red that ran from its collar all the way down to the hem of the robe at the floor of the craft. Cassidy turned to Adams then with a serious look in her eyes. "And now we go to the top of the peak," she frowned. "This is a very important custom for them, and they say they are honored to have you, us, join them." Adams began to grow anxious. "Oh, that's flattering." He gave a weak smile and grabbed onto the side of the car as it floated up faster now, like an elevator. The car flew through the clouds of steam, and Adams found himself mesmerized by the rocky protrusions of the volcanic surface that slipped out of view below. The smell of sulfur was strong now, and Adams felt a growing urge to vomit. "Probably should have eaten something this morning," he said weakly. "You weren't giving anything to eat?" Cassidy frowned again. Adams did seem to remember that nobody had eaten. He had been so wrapped up in the excitement of the descent that he had not bothered to ask about it. Adam's stomach seemed to jump as the craft came fast to a stop. They were surrounded by steam, but he could make out the hazy outline of the edge of the volcano. He stepped off, following Cassidy and XR-62, trailed by soldier XR-61. The humidity was forcing sweat to drip from Adam's brow, and walking through it felt like walking through water at the surface of a swimming pool. The soldiers were sweating now too, though they continued to stare forward with no emotion. For 5 minutes they marched, and Adams could feel himself weakening. Finally he did stop, and he vomited over a rock to the right of the path. He was pulled to his feet by XR-61. "Let's go," the soldier said, putting Adams back on the path behind Cassidy. Almost too roughly, he thought. "Thanks," Adams said weakly. "I sure hope there's a hotel on the other side of this volcano," he joked, but no one was laughing. Cassidy looked back once with a frown. For 5 minutes more they walked until the path began to widen and they reached a clearing. There was a small group of Vesuvians, also wearing white red striped robes, and they were all gathered with heads bowed at a large rock. As they approached, Adams began to grow scared. The rock was a totem, carved with a face he had become familiar with. It was the Vesuvian fire god. Beyond the totem was the edge of an enormous opening circling outward in either direction into the fog. This was the opening to the volcano that towered so high over the Vesuvian capital. "What is going on here?" Adams said, trying to laugh but hearing the fear in his voice. "Some sort of ceremony?" "Doctor, I tried to warn you," Cassidy said, stepping out of the way as 2 pairs of camouflaged arms gripped his own. "I don't understand, Cassidy. Soldier XR, I don't know. What are you guys doing?" He knew it was hopeless to ask, as soldiers weren't permitted to talk to cargo. They were just doing their job, as he had been brought here to do. Or so he had thought. They dragged him toward the totem, his feet sliding across the rocky surface of the volcano. "The council has its own prerogative, Doctor. You know this." "Yes, but—" And suddenly he thought he knew. "The mineral." "There were pages left out of the report, Doctor. The council has known about Vesuvius 9 for some time." Adams was dropped in front of the robed Vesuvians. They began to hum in a low tone that must have seemed like a prayer to them, but was painfully ominous to Adams's ears. "We could have gone to the other planets, but there was nothing of value to the council, nothing worth trading for." The Vesuvians parted now, leaving the weak doctor to stare up at the terrifying gaze of the Vesuvian fire god carved into the totem. He imagined the creature breathing the sulfur out of its hideous mouth. "The council wanted what Vesuvius has in abundance. The catch was, they were on sacred ground." Adams was hardly listening to Cassidy. He thought he understood everything now, and he began to weep. "So they made a trade, a sacrifice, Dr. Adams, to their fire god, to the god of the very thing the council wanted." Adams was grabbed by the soldiers again, and they ushered him toward the rim of the volcano. Heat wafted up into his face like the breath of a dragon. Its depth seemed to go on forever, but he knew they stopped somewhere down there, in a bubbling soup of magma that would one day erupt, in which the Vesuvians still believed they had to keep at bay with such rituals of sacrifice. They had not yet known that the fire god was not real, that the only god here, Mother Nature, had already been outsmarted by the material they had learned to produce, that they had been taught to use by their sky god, some long-gone race that abandoned them for the stars. "I tried to warn you," Cassidy's voice rang out one last time from behind him. The soldiers pushed, and Adams fell forward into the mouth of the volcano, the belly of the beast. His skin began to heat up, and he could smell his hair beginning to singe. He did not scream. He just let himself fall, turning in his descent and watching the sky at the opening of the volcano shrink. And as he fell for what seemed like eternity, he saw the red Vesuvian sun burning in effigy. He could not be sure, but he thought, for the last time in his life before his own light was extinguished, that he had seen the eyes of the Vesuvian fire god in that sun, staring menacingly down at him, pleased with the sacrifice its patrons had made.